Now this section is a history of the people in the Bible who communicated with God and how they actually did that. If you don't want to look through this section and jump straight to the practical application, then feel free to skip it. It does give a lot of background into who, what, and when people communicated with God, and you may find that helpful in your everyday practice. This is especially true if people start to ask you or to accuse you about using these practices. Now, we know that the Bible is filled with countless people who talked with God. I mean, that's how we got the Bible, right? Even though many of these people heard from God, we aren't always told how they communicated with Him, though. The times that it does mention how they heard from God, the method varies from person to person. So going through the Bible, we can find different times where certain ways are prevalent, and we find different people hear from God in very specific ways to themselves. We see examples of these tools in the lives of the people throughout the Bible, though. Starting from the beginning seems like a pretty good place to start. We know that Adam and Eve were said to walk and talk with God in the Garden of Eden. Now, God also spoke with Cain directly, as far as we can tell. But after that, it gets a little bit more fuzzy. From Cain until Noah, we don't have much specifically said about how God spoke with people at all. Even from Noah, it just says that he heard from God. Now, that might be metaphorically, that might be any different method. And then from Noah all the way until Moses, we seem to just have mention of God communicating with people through dreams. Now, getting insight from the spirit world through dreams is one of the most common ways that we find in the Bible. We're going to go more into depth in that later on, but it is worth to note that pretty much anyone that you have ever met will most likely have an interesting dream that stands out as having some significance in their life in one form or another. It's one of those interesting campfire things to just ask around for interesting dreams of people's lives. You'll be curious about what you find out about people. Now, there seems to be an erroneous train of thought in our modern society that the wide range of influences of the Western materialism has had on us is just staggering to me. There's a thought that is very prevalent that assumes that if we have scientifically proved that something happens in relationship to something else, then that explains it. Now, dreams are a really good example of this. There have been many studies done about how dreams work and how our brains work when we're asleep. Just because we know that our brains are working and dreaming while we sleep doesn't mean that other things aren't influencing it. Now, at the same time, another good example would be love. We know that our bodies have chemical changes when we are in love, but that doesn't explain the other influences our life has when we're in love. Like, we'll have flashes of sadness and nausea at the sudden memory of a loved one, or the irrational resolution to give up one's life for a child. Not to mention those supernatural connections that people in love often have, like reading each other's thoughts and stuff like that. Now, just because we know something physically happens with our bodies when we're in love doesn't explain that all these other things are happening. And I think the same thing is true when we open ourselves up to the possibility that even when science has proved something, that there aren't other things at work at the same time. Now, that was a bit of a tangent, but to get back on track, we come to Moses' life. Now, Moses is interesting because he lived as a prince of Egypt until he was 40. This is a very unique upbringing. Egyptian royalty were trained since they were very, very young to have interactions with the spirit world. He would have a really intimate knowledge of many forms of divination. He would also have been taught different techniques of just spiritual contact. The Egyptian culture was at the forefront of having an actual process or ritual work with the spirit world. We see with Moses, though, that at first we don't really know how he talked to God. It seems like he hears an audible voice with the detail of what God says to him. But only on one occasion does it actually say God spoke to him face to face as talking with a man. On the other occasions, it just doesn't mention how Moses heard from God. Now, when it does say how he got his knowledge, it is interesting that it has a very wide variety of ways that he heard from God. Not only did he hear God's voice, but at other times he has dreams, visions, which are kind of dreams during the day, and dramatic signs. One of these times is the story of his calling. God draws near to him and speaks to him in a burning bush. We also find him using postures with God. Now, we're going to go into postures in much more detail in a later section. But at one point, Israel is in a battle. And if Moses stands up with his arms raised, holding up his staff in this posture, then they win. But if he has his hands dropped down, they start to lose. This is actually a posture that you find throughout historic culture. We also have the first record of the Urim and Thummim at the time of Moses. These were two items, probably bones, that the high priest kept in their breastplate, and they could use it for divining what God's will was about a certain situation. One of my favorite ways to hear God's will that Moses uses, I like to call, if this, then that. It would go something like this. Moses would say, if this is your will, God, then fill in the blank. And if that thing that he mentions happens, then he knew it was God's will. Now, this method just has so much practical application. It is such a powerful tool to use today. Now, Moses was very unique in many methods that he used to communicate with God, and it would be interesting to contemplate that if his upbringing in Egypt allowed him or opened him up to using many of these options, or if that's just kind of coincidence. We will see all of his methods used later on by other people throughout the Old Testament, though. Joshua and the Judges. Now, after Moses, we have Joshua, and we mostly find him hearing from God in dreams. After Joshua, though, is a multitude of judges. The judges were often unlearned men. They were normally people that God chose specifically to affect Israel's situation in that moment. We're going to lump some of these judges together. Many of them just heard from God in dreams. But many times they heard directly from God. We don't actually know their method. Now, this may be for several reasons. Because they were unlearned, they may have decided not to mention in their writings how they were getting God's direction, maybe from fear of mockery or opposition from people. Another reason is it's possible that they didn't even know how they were communicating with God. In certain instances, it describes their communication as the if this then that method that we just talked about earlier. We also have the ominous still small voice. I mention this because of all the different methods, for some reason I've seen that Christians have really grabbed on to this one and run away with it. Now, some people claim that this is actually the only way that we hear from God right now. Pray to God, and you'll hear a still small voice giving you the answer. Now, I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but in the Bible, it is a very uncommon way that God talks to people. That method is not described very often in the Bible. Now, during the time of the Judges, we also get more familiar with the casting of lots. Now, the most common modern phrase for this would be drawing the short straw or drawing the name out of a hat. It's a basic, seemingly random act that allows us to know what the will of God is for us. For being such a really basic method, though, we find the casting of lots throughout the Bible a lot.